Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Louis Falgout. And Get Recc'd is our fortnightly podcast, wherein at the end of every episode, I recommend some piece of media to Stephen, and he recommends something to me. And in the next episode, we then discuss those recommendations. And today, we are beginning the start of the trilogy RE-RECC. And RE-RECC is where we're recommending things that are related to previous recommendations that we have had. So you can kind of look at it as a revisit. And Stephen, why don't you go ahead and hype everyone up for the incredible battle we have taking place today?
Well, before we go there, I'd like to just add a little flavor to that as well. We've called it RE-RECC, but it shouldn't be confused with something we've already recommended. It's just something already within the same context of what we've recommended. So with that being said, Louis, before I had recommended to you Ariana Grande's album. You had recommended to me a Swans album. Today, the battle has started. In this corner, we have pop icon Ariana. That's the fans going wild. Yeah, Swan sucks. In the other corner.
Yeah.
I'll pass it to my co-host.
I see what's going on here. I wasn't catching the improv we were doing. In the other corner, we have the mighty Swans. The fireworks. Yeah. All right, there you go.
That's our hype up for you all. This is the fated duel. Play John Williams' Duel of the Fates, because today it is Ariana Grande versus Swans, a battle for the ages. This is how it's always been. This is where it always was going to go. From episode 1, we've planted the seeds. If you go back every episode, it's our podcast cinematic universe. You can see little hints at this, our Infinity War of albums that we're going to talk about today. Why is it so important? Well, because I listened to a Swans album and it sucked. and I said Ariana Grande was good, so it's become a whole thing where Ariana Grande is basically the top tier, the top echelon of musical performance for everything to be placed against. Now, today, we are once again looking at, and in the same episode, a Swans album, an Ariana Grande album. This is it, Louis.
Yeah. And I think that with that, we should probably get into it. And Stephen, I would actually like to begin with what you recommended to me, if that's all right with you, which we've kind of already explained, but go a little more into specifically what this is, and we'll go from there.
So, Louis, I recommended to you Ariana Grande's most recent album, Thank You Next. Thank You Next came out just earlier this year, and it only came out not even maybe like half a year after her last release, Sweetener, which came out, I believe, last summer. Essentially, Sweetener was an album where Ariana Grande became a little more introspective and really started to talk about her relationship with her then fiance, who just shortly after, a whole bunch of stuff happened to her. Her ex-boyfriend, Mac Miller, died. She broke up with Pete Davidson, her at the time fiance. And through all of this, she decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a second album. And they didn't even start actually recording this album until after the release of Sweetener. So this was something that basically got turned around within 6 months. As I mentioned, it came out this year. I think it came out around February. So, Louis, with that, I will turn it over to you to talk about Thank You Next.
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd like to say is go back real quick, since it is RE-RECC, to what happened last time I talked about Ariana Grande. Now, Stephen recommended me the album My Everything, which I believe was her 2014 release, which was
her second release.
Her second album, yeah. And I really did not like it. I mean, not only did I not like it, but I frankly thought it was bad. And the funny thing about that discussion that we had was I made it a goal to press Steven on it, because as I was listening to it, I was just like, all right, there's seriously nothing to this. And I pressed him on it, to which he replied he likes shitty pop. So that's what happened last time. And So I guess you could say for sure that my impressions of Ariana Grande were very low, because I really hadn't listened to anything she ever did at the time that Steven recommended that to me.
And to be clear, when Lewis says that, Lewis really doesn't listen to radio. So it's like...
At all, no.
So it's like when he says that, it's like probably, Lewis, I'm guessing, unless maybe in passing at like a bowling alley or something, you might not have even heard many of those songs.
No, I hadn't heard a single one of them. I didn't recognize any of them. So I didn't like it, right? So, quite simple. And
Lewis, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but do you know what we happened to score that album?
I gave it a 4 and you gave it a 7.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, my impressions were low. Going into this album, though, I had heard hype around this album actually a decent amount before you even recommended it to me. And actually her previous album before this one as well, I'd heard some good things about as well. So I really actually was kind of excited when Steven recc'd this to me, because I really wanted to really enjoy this album. Like, it just seemed like something that would really be interesting, and I heard she's taken a new direction, and given all the recent events that I heard she was addressing, dating all the way back to that crazy Manchester bombing that happened at her show, I thought this would be a really interesting listen. And I guess that's the best way to set this one up. So the first thing I want to say about this album is I'd like to point out how this is substantially different in actually a number of ways from what I knew from Ariana going into this, because again, the only Ariana I knew was what I heard on My Everything. For starters, on My Everything, I think I made it the biggest point that I found the album to be a sterile, generic pop album. And what I meant by that wasn't just that it was a clean pop album for the radio, it was that I didn't see any point of separation between Ariana and her contemporaries, honestly. I just really didn't. Particularly as a performer, but also just the music that was coming out of it. I didn't think it was really any good. I thought, sure, she could sing really well, but that it just doesn't do much for me beyond that when the music she was making just wasn't interesting at all. And what I found interesting about Thank You Next is that I really do think Ariana actually has a lot more of personality and character in this album, where I can listen to this album and be like, oh, that's Ariana Grande there, that's her voice. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is it sounds like she's found her voice. There's a kind of attitude on this album that you didn't have then. There's really a lot of things about this that make it feel like it isn't just any old run-of-the-mill pop album. And really, I think that's my biggest point that I want to commend the album as a whole on. Because I really do think that that this is a direction she is going, and not just which way's the wind blowing, And that speaks a lot to her as an artist, and I appreciate it. And before I go any further, I want to see if Steven has any comments on that, because I got a twist that's coming.
Well, I definitely agree. I think, and you mentioned her finding a voice, and I think that one thing that's very different between this album and the last album we looked at is that not only do I feel like we've finally connected with Ariana Grande's voice, but I think even like vocally and lyrically, I think we've really connected with who she is. And this is definitely her most introspective album to date. I mean, there is a ton that has happened to her within the last 2 years. You mentioned it, going all the way back to the bombing that occurred, the terrible tragedy, and then also all of the relationship stuff that she's had to deal with, both between breaking up with her fiance, but also the death of one of her exes. And you really feel that in this album. I think one thing, and maybe this is kind of going beyond what you just talked about, Lewis. But I think one thing that's really interesting about this album is that it's not a healing album fully, although it is definitely there. A lot of the lyrics, a lot of the tracks here are about her healing and about her coping and dealing with all that's happened to her. But it's also, what's interesting, a very vulnerable album, I found, because a lot of the tracks here, it's like, okay, you have a couple tracks about how, like, she's so in her head, she's thinking about Mac Miller. I mean, we'll talk about the track specifically, but she's thinking about Mac Miller, she's thinking about everything that happened to her, but at the same time she's still going on these crazy spending sprees and living this exorbitant life that's frankly a probably terrible part of recovery, but also for her probably a necessary part of recovery. And there's a whole bunch of that going on here, which I think is really interesting. So you really get a perspective of where she is as a person.
Yeah, and I can agree with pretty much everything you said there. I also would like to stress that I really don't think this album is like a concept album level of this is all about her, you know? But I do think even the tracks that aren't really, that are just kind of an Ariana Grande song, even those songs, there's usually some lyrical reference to something else going on there. And for that reason, yeah. So anyway, all that stuff, respect it. I think it's cool that Ariana Grande is, that this is a different album, and I'm happy that I listened to it from that angle. Now here's the twist. Here's the twist. I still didn't like it. Okay. So how do I start with this? So here's the thing. Everything that we just said applies. However, I have to wonder at some point, especially when I'm listening to this album, and there's one song in particular that I think really cements my opinion on this. It seems to me that if this is what Ariana is going for, if this is the kind of album I'm going to hear, and this is what I thought I was going to hear, that is part of the reason why I was so thoroughly unimpressed with this record. I felt like immediately from track one, just going track and track and track on, I was listening to a lot of really subdued, low-key, sleepy vibe music, with Ariana, the same, very good singing, but the hooks on this album are incredibly bland. The performances are nice, but those on top of these sleepy, chill, vibey kind of beats, it's just so whatever. It just felt like such a utterly, honestly bland concoction. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that strongly. And I acknowledge that the production here has something to it. Her mixing her pop and kind of R&B style with trap production, trap influence production, I should say, is, again, it's different than what I heard from her before, and it's more unique than that. But is this really something that I'm like shocked came out of a top 40 pop artist? Not really. And the song I was talking about when I said there's a song that really cements this for me is the song Ghostin'. Because Ghostin' is excellent. Like, Ghostin' is everything that I wanted to hear on this album and more. I mean, when that song came on my first listen, by this point I was really dulled. I was just like, all right, I'm getting nothing out of this. And Ghostin' came on, and I was just like, holy shit. Like, it sounds like Ariana went Kate Bush or something. Like, this beautiful, lush string section, her incredible voice over this, and these lyrics, these tear-jerking lyrics where it's all about how, it's probably the most personal song on the record, where she talks about how much it hurts her that her current boyfriend has to see her crying over the death of Mac Miller. And it really does get that. It basically gets that specific, when she just doesn't say any names. And it was incredible. I mean, I was really like, wow, this is really, really something. And not only that, but like, this is a direction I never saw her going in. Not only a direction this personal, but also this beautiful and artistic. It's just not what I ever would have expected to hear from her from going off the last album. And perhaps like me loving that song so much is what ultimately cemented my opinion that this thing is just really bland, because I don't think that any other song here even comes close or even compares to that song. I mean, in really any way.
Lewis, I will say you have a very a very interesting take on this, because I would actually reckon to imagine that if you were to poll most people on this album, they would actually probably have put the song that you think is the best as the worst.
Yeah, shocker there, right? I'm not shocked at all.
But I do agree with you. I think Ghostin' is an incredible song. I mean, it is so depressing too. It really is. But if you were to look at the rest of these tracks, and I do agree with you, a lot of these she has, and Sweetener was kind of in this same oeuvre where it's like she started to create these almost sleepy time tracks, which is interesting. But I think that in this album specifically, that fits very well with the message that she's trying to convey for the most part. Now, I think there are some tracks here that I actually don't enjoy that much. I think Bloodline is a really odd track in this track list. Like, it's so fundamentally different to me than any of the other tracks, and it kind of comes out of nowhere.
Did you say Bloodline?
I said Bloodline.
Okay,
yep.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But the rest of these, I don't think that besides Bloodline, I don't think that there's a single track on this track list that I don't enjoy. I think that, hands down, to me, Thank You Next is Ariana Grande's best album to date. Easily. I think that Imagine is a great start to this track. NASA is a really great track. I think there are some lulls for the most part, but as you get to Thank You Next and Break Up With Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored, those are just pure pop tracks that have a clear message, and honestly are very different than the message that's out there on the radio right now. One thing that I'll mention is that this has no bearing on our opinion of this thing, but what's very interesting is Thank You Next and Seven Rings were two singles that came out almost immediately after Sweetener, within a couple months. Like, honestly, as soon as they were recorded, they were sent to radio, and they were on the chart at the same time, and they happened to reach number 1 and number 2 simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And I think that their sticking power, even now, showcases their ability to be that really powerful pop track that I think is quite different than a lot of pop tracks that you're getting right now on the radio. Now, I don't like Seven Rings as much as I think Thank You Next is a really great song, and I think Imagine is a really great song, and those are both on the radio right now. But even the tracks that haven't made it to radio, as you mentioned, Ghostin', I think In My Head, I like Fake Smile a lot. I like the samples that she's using, because she really does have, you mentioned it, kind of this, she's always had an R&B pop influence and kind of a blend of those, especially in her first album in Sweetener, maybe not so much in the one that you listen to, but now she's kind of got this like trap or like trap production influence, a lot of trap influence, a lot of songs he's come out in, like Bloodline and some others. I think that combination has really culminated now to something that I think is finally an album that she can stand up to and say that, obviously all of her albums have been incredibly successful, but this is something that I think is so personal and has so much consistency, I feel, throughout the board, that this is something that I have really come to enjoy now for the only couple months that it's been out.
Sure. I mean, I will definitely agree with you that the album is consistent. What I wanted to say, Ghostin' isn't the only song I like. I think Thank You Next is okay. I think that's an okay song. I think the melody in there is actually quite pretty, pretty simple but quite pretty. And I enjoy the idea of like her just writing a song where she's thankful for all of the people she's broken up with because they taught her something. It's nice, right? I mean, when you hear a breakup song, this typically is not, this really is not the way that you hear it go. And I thought that was neat.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. Is I think that "Thank You Next" is a really powerful breakup song because it is a breakup song that's not something that you would normally get from a breakup song. It's it's more reflective and as the song title says, it's thankful. And then when you put that, and what was interesting is obviously that came out as a single, and everyone was like, "Oh wow, that's great." And then now, as you put it in the context of this album, though, it's such an interesting place at the second to last, because then the last song is "Break Up with Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored." So "Thank You Next" is this thankful, this reflective journey that she's been on, but then she goes right back to basically having these tendencies of just, finding that next guy sort of a thing. So she hasn't truly moved on, or she still has these kind of destructive tendencies. And that's really what I was mentioning at the onset of this, kind of flows throughout this whole album. These like reflective and really deep, really personal looks at her relationships and all those things that have happened to her, but then also these kind of still destructive tendencies that come out between like Seven Rings and "Break Up with Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored." Lewis, what did you think of the samples? There weren't that many of them, but the few samples that made it onto this album.
Yeah. Give me a moment. Oh yeah. So I wanted to say that yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I had. Okay. Back on track. Yes. "Break Up with Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored." Why is that the closer?
I mean, but I do think it fits really well as a closer for this album. Now, I don't think
Why?
it needed to be the closer. For what I just mentioned. I just talked about it.
Okay, I know. Okay, I'm sorry. Look, look. The thing is, okay. Here's the thing. So I actually think this album would have done pretty okay if it ended on the title track, because break up with that song, the final song. It's like literally. I think any other song, if you put it in the closer spot, would have worked better than this one.
But I think it's more interesting that this album closed in that song, not for its musical quality, but for its message. Because you go from "Thank You Next" to "Break Up with Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored," I think that there's a message there. If this album ended on "Thank You Next," I think there would also be a message, and it could have definitely done that as well. But I think the message is more interesting that it ends on "Break Up with Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored."
But it's not like. First of all, sonically, it just sounds like another song, like more so than any of the other songs do. And on top of that, like. I don't know, like, okay, I actually happen to know something that Ariana Grande herself said that reinforced my opinion on this, because I happen to know that this was not intended to be the closer. And I don't know if you saw this, but somebody asked her, I don't remember when this came out actually, but I saw a tweet from her where she said that like the final track she was going to put in this album, she decided was too personal and she didn't want to share it with the world, and so she decided to go with something fun instead. She said that in a tweet. And so not only did I feel like "Break Up with Your Girlfriend" didn't make any sense as the closer, and I always felt incredibly dissatisfied with it at the end of the album, but I happened to actually know that it was not supposed to be the closer. She was initially going to go with something that was more personal. By the way, totally respect the decision not to do that. I understand. But if she had done that, I get the feeling this album would have come out much better as a result, or the ending of the album would have come out much better as a result, because I don't know, there's just something about changing the tone that hard that I'm just not in favor with. And I understand some people will argue it's like it's subversive, or it's like a subversion of the album's whatever, and that somebody Mash just said that, and I guess I can see that take, but I don't see why you'd want to subvert this album in that way. I just don't see any good reason to do that. I don't know. I mean, and besides, if you did the title track the title track changes the tone a little bit as well, but it still fits within the theme. Like, for example, the tone, in that song, she talked about how thankful she is for everybody that, even the people she's broken up with. And And that actually relates to a lot of the situations that caused her to make this album in the first place, right? So it would make sense, even though it's a happier and a more celebratory song than other ones here, it would still work. So yeah, I just can't see why that song was the closer. I really can't. But yeah. Real quick. So just to be clear, actually, I don't. The only song I actually dislike on this album, the only song that I dislike on this album is Seven Rings. That's the only song I just straight up don't like. I think is a bad song. Every other song I don't think is bad. I just find them to be. I mean, I don't know. The thing about Seven Rings is her using the whole my favorite things and singing the melody to my favorite things was really awkward, and I did not enjoy that. But yeah, besides that, everything just kind of, I don't know, just left me cold. I just really wasn't impressed with any of it. I think the production is fine. I think her singing's great, but again, that really doesn't do anything for me if the songs aren't really there. And again, I feel like the hooks are really weak on this thing. Lyrics are occasionally great, but usually not really. In fact, some of the lyrical themes she chooses in some of these songs, like on NASA, I thought to be pretty corny, and makeup as well. I just want to call out real quick, sampling the same. Every time I heard Fake Smile, I just thought of Wu-Tang, because Wu-Tang sampled that same song, and every time that song started, I thought I was going to listen to Wu-Tang, and then I was disappointed every time. So yeah. Anyway.
All right. Well, that I think is your mic drop then, Lewis. As we move,
my mic drop is I'd rather
be listening to Wu-Tang. So with that, I think we should move on to Lewis.
I think we should. Do you want to wait to score both of them until the very end to do like a final showdown kind of thing?
Oh, okay,
or are we just doing it now?
All right. No, I'm good with that.
We want to wait. Okay, cool. That wasn't my.
So right now, the fans are like, "Boo! Psh, no, you're wrong."
Yeah, they're so mad. And then I'm about to bust out that 10 for Ariana at the end. Bet you weren't expecting that.
Oh.
Anyway, okay. Yeah.
Subvert this.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll move on then, I suppose. And that's my apology. Here's my formal apology to everybody at the end of that, okay? All right,
Yeah,
cool.
Because Lewis is wrong. All right, moving on.
All right, moving on. So last time I recommended to Steven Swans' 2014 album, To Be Kind. This is the second to most recent Swans album. They released one in 2016, but besides that, we'll call it their most recent just for the purposes of this episode. It isn't, but we'll say that it is. Previously, in episode 3 of Get Recc'd, I recommended to Steven the album Filth, which is their first album. And I think I'll let you provide any extra context between these two albums that you wish to provide yourself. And so with that, I will allow Steven to talk about what he thought.
Well, Lewis, can you talk about generally how they progressed last time?
What do you mean?
Like you did with Ariana. Can you talk about any thoughts? What was our scores?
Oh yeah. So that's right. That's very important to mention. So in the third episode of Get Recc'd, when we went to review this, Steven ended up giving Filth a 2 out of 10, which to date is one of the lowest scores he has given. And in fact, for reference, I think the only other thing Steven gave scores that low to was Blue Collar Comedy Tour, Norm of the North, and a Death Grips album, No Love Deep Web. And I don't think he gave anything else a score that low. If I'm forgetting anything, you guys could back me up, but I'm pretty sure it was in the bottom 4. So yeah. Up to this point, it was Steven's defended opinion that not only was Swans Filth, if not one of the worst album
and appropriately titled
he heard on this podcast, and on top of that, he ardently suggested that Ariana Grande was better than Swans. So that was kind of the whole thing. And For the record, I mean, and I'll just put this out right here. I mean, almost everybody here knows this. But Swans is my favorite band. Filth is not among my favorite Swans albums. I gave it to Steven because I thought it would weird him out and he'd hate it, and I was right, so I guess it worked. But I gave the album an 8 that time. And yeah, obviously it's been a long time since 1983 when that came out to 2014. And yeah, I think that's all I wanted me to say, Steven, on that.
Yeah.
All right, then go ahead.
Okay. So last time we talked about Swans, as you mentioned, you gave me Filth. Now, I thought at the time, as I had mentioned, the album was very appropriately titled because I thought that it was just straight up trash. Now, it was a lot. I think I had made comments about how it was just kind of like mindless noise. I didn't really get it, and it confused my Ariana Grande loving brain. So now, this album, I want to start off by saying that I don't think that this is entirely dissimilar from Filth, but I do think that this is very dissimilar from Filth, from what I heard. Now, I think a lot of the tracks are actually sonically, in this case, very interesting. This thing is very long. Yeah. I will start by saying
2
that.
2 hours
so
in
it's
length.
It's like 2 hours. So it took me a long time and many listens to kind of get through this and to comprehend this. And that's why I will also mention that this episode's a little later than normal because we really wanted to come in swinging. So with that being said, I think I'm going to surprise everyone by saying that I really enjoyed this. So sorry to all you Grandes out there. And look now, no, you've forsaken us.
The Grande side of the audience is crying. They're running out the door. They're throwing tomatoes at Steven. This is a disaster. Steven, you've let your side down. I can't believe you.
You're
not supposed to do this.
My Venn diagram of people who like Ariana Grande and don't like Swans and only like and that's their whole thing. That I let them down. Look as the chat cries. Tears.
Give it a 4. Give it a 4. Oh, damn. What a disappointing day.
So, okay, let's talk about this.
Yeah, let's.
Now, I'm looking at a Wikipedia track list, and it's very confusing. So let me make sure it's the track list that...
It's the track... Did you listen to this on Spotify? It's the track list you heard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So... I'm going to kind of jump around and I want to first start by talking about this kind of as a whole, and then I'll jump around to a couple specific tracks that I really enjoyed. So as a whole, I think what's so interesting about this is that, like I mentioned, I don't think this is entirely dissimilar from Filth, in that there's a lot, they're using a lot of sounds and noise to kind of create a full composition. Now, Filth, I think what's mostly different to me is that maybe it was something about the production of Filth or the quality of noise that they were generating in Filth that just really made it feel like, to me, I wasn't listening to anything but nonsense. Whereas here, it's kind of all constructed it's constructed and produced in a way that's very pleasing. I really like a lot of what they're using track to track. I don't know if I want to talk about lyrics because ultimately I feel like they're, anyway, as long as many times as I've listened to it, I really can't ascertain much except for like he says words sometimes over and over again, but in such a way that I think that they really flow well together. They add something to the entire mix. I will say that generally I really enjoyed all of the percussion that they have within the tracks, and I even feel like a lot of that percussion is kind of sustained or replicated across some of the tracks. I like a lot of the samples that they're taking, just kind of random, basically like radio samples of educational tracks, or at some point there's like horse hooves, and it's very interesting to listen to. This whole album, what I would say, it's very interesting to listen to. Essentially, like in a dark room with your eyes closed, and you're just kind of letting it consume you, because that's what I really feel like where this thing shines. It's creating this entire mix of sound and sonics that are really enveloping you and taking you to another place. Some of the specific tracks that I'll talk about are tracks like Bring the Sun, which is an incredibly long track, and some others. But I think actually, before I go there, Lewis, do you have any general thoughts?
I have many general thoughts.
I know, and I know you've done a whole podcast on this, so it's like,
I just want to point out that in recent memory, I've talked about this album so much that like I just spent Hurley and I, well, my temporary co-host that day on the Music Breakdown podcast, talked about this album for 20 minutes or something, and I think it just basically came down to us moaning into our microphones for like 20 minutes, which kind of became a bit of a joke. Well, namely him, but I did a whole Swans retrospective before where I talked about this thing for like 10 minutes. I mean, yes, I've talked about this so much. And in my server, I've brought up a lot of things about this as well. I think the first thing I'd like to say to make it clear how I stand on this is actually my third favorite album of all time. There are only
number one being Thank You Next.
Number one being Thank You Next, and number two being My Everything. So I can confirm that Ariana Grande is better, but that kind of goes without saying at this point. But I oh shit, I gave it away. Anyway, I mean, all right. So I want to let you talk the most. I have things to say, but again, these people here have heard me say all this before. But whatever. For starters, I think the most incredible thing about To Be Kind, perhaps, as I listen to this thing more and more, and I've listened to this album, it's got to have been well over 100 times now. Anytime I have the opportunity, I have 2 hours and nothing to do, To Be Kind. Or The Seer, I suppose, but To Be Kind. And what is so incredible about this is that just the amount of intricacy that there actually is to this album. And you may be able to agree with me, but I don't think you will ever be able to fully grasp all of that until you've heard it like a lot. Because, as we've said, the album is indeed 2 hours long, and there's only 10 tracks, and every song is over 5 minutes, but most of them are over like 7, 8, 9, 10, 35, in the case of Bring the Sun, Toussaint Louverture. And it's like, even though they stretch these songs out for insane lengths, and even though when you show this to your average listener, they'll be like, why are they playing the same thing for like, so long? Because almost every single song revolves around a repetitive groove being repeated ad nauseum. But the thing is that this band never lets a groove sit like that. Every single thing here has its place. And if you pay it close attention too, even when the band is just writing on the same groove for a little while and nothing's being added, there's subtle little variations that they're doing instrument by instrument, little improvisational differences, little guitar licks, any kinds of things to spice it up at all points in time and keep it interesting and keep it tense. And it works in such a way where these hypnotic grooves begin to get added on in these really intricate and sometimes subtle and sometimes obvious ways, where a new instrument will come in, a new melody will come in, drums will come in, things like that, slowly over time. And everything works to create this incredible sense of tension. And all of that consistently builds until the band releases in a series of musical climaxes that are so out of this world astonishing that my mind cannot ever fully wrap itself around how they even managed to create them. I mean, and if we're talking about that, besides Some Things We Do, there is not a single song here that doesn't masterfully build tension only to release it in just glorious ways every single time. And I'll let you go off of that. I have other specific things, but we'll keep going.
I think that this album as you mentioned, does a really great job at building and releasing tension. I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed most about listening to this album. And when you get to Be Kind, the final track in this album, it's kind of like, like a little breath. You're like,
Well,
it's all,
yeah, until it
it's,
crushes you in the final 4 minutes. Yeah.
yeah, but maybe you like that. I don't know.
I do a lot. Yes.
So anyway, I'll go to a couple tracks. Bring the Sun, I like a lot. I want to talk about that track because it's so long. It is like 35 minutes of track. I will say that the track is split, and it has pretty much a demarcation in the middle where you're kind of bridging the gap between the two quote unquote tracks within the 135-minute time frame. I think for me personally, I want to talk about that track only because it is so long. As I mentioned before, they're kind of using samples of like horse hooves and other kind of noise to create that bridge between the two. I think that's very interesting. I really like Bring the Sun. I'm not as big of a fan as the second half. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it necessarily, but I think that
Yep.
yeah, but that track especially does start to wear me down after a certain point because it is just so egregiously long on this thing. The other thing I'll mention is that because this track is so long and that sonically it really does kind of flow so well, it's quite an experience to sit through this thing. You really have to be ready to sit through a 2-hour album because although there are highs and lows, it's really kind of one continuous body of work that you're working your way through. So in that sense, on some of my later listen tos, or maybe I should say actually on some of my earlier listen tos, it was really hard to take it all in because at a certain point you're just like, okay, this thing is going on for so long. So you really do have to, I would say, to really grasp this thing, kind of bite it up in chunks, listen to the whole thing a couple times, really envelop yourself within it. But I think that is really a credit to the album because it makes you want to do that.
Yeah. I need to jump in here because you talked about Bring the Sun, right? So all of my everybody here, well, I think most people in the chat here know this already because I've said it so much. Bring the Sun, Toussaint Louverture is my favorite song of all time. This is the greatest piece of music I've ever heard, and I don't see my mind changing on it. And
all right, get that out of here. I don't agree with that at all.
It is astonishing. I mean, the Bring the Sun section has the most monstrous and impeccable climax, or I should say, well, yes, that, but crescendo you will ever hear. And I've said this before, but I dare anybody to find me a musical crescendo that is this enormous. Going from, first of all, when the track opens and it just slams you with that insanely bright and heavenly but super heavy chords just smashing into you for like 2 minutes. The track lets itself breathe and becomes so quiet and floaty, and it in the span of 14 minutes, it turns into the loudest and most insane thing that I have ever heard. And it slowly works its way there, but with each element that gets added, from the snare roll to the choir vocals, and there's a certain point in that track where you already think it's gotten as loud as it can possibly get, and it still has like 5 minutes to go, and it just keeps getting louder. And honestly, this section of the song puts me in a complete trance. It just blows my mind. It's like mind explosion every single time. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's truly like, I don't even know how they accomplished this with the instruments that they have. I have no idea. But it is incredible. And then the transition between this and Toussaint Louverture is also impeccable, and it begins to give you this sense of oppression, like with those horse sounds of horses screaming as they struggle to get away, and sounds of sawing wood. And then the band blasts you with this wall of noise at a certain point. It leads you into the section of the song where Gerard here gives just wild and crazed vocal performance, shouting the name of the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, who led the first successful slave revolt. And it's like this idea of this freedom from oppression, and the music here perfectly represents that. It all takes a backstage so that Gerard can just give the wildest and most insane vocal performance of his entire career, and the dude was in his 60s. And it's just insane, and he grabs my attention so much. And then even then at the end of this section, the band cleverly gives you one more climax as they build into this insane, intense wall of noise 2 more times before the song lets out. So while I think it's fair to say that the song is incredibly long and definitely feels it, I am not going to disagree there. I'd love to say, given that this thing blows my mind so much, that it feels like it feels shorter than it is, but I don't believe that. This thing feels like it goes on for hours, but frankly, I wish it went on for hours. Like, I mean, bring the sun part alone, and then you add the Toussaint Louverture, and the whole thing is just, I don't know. It's godly. It is a god tier song. So I will say I'm not surprised that you mentioned that you felt worn down by the Toussaint Louverture section. It doesn't surprise me, but very, very strong disagree there.
I would agree to what you had mentioned about, this album being long, but wanting it to be long. This is the case where, in this specific instance, my score will probably be knocked by the length of this thing, as some of these often are. I think this happened maybe once or twice before, but what's a little different is I would say that I'm not entirely knocking it based on the length, because I do actually enjoy the experience of listening to this thing for as long as it goes on. Now, the only difference is it's like, okay, would I want to like continually sit through this because of how long it is? Probably not. It is a lot. I could now definitely see this like putting it on in the background, and like just having it on, having it there while you're doing something for literally 2 hours, but even still, I just wanted to make that mention that if I'm sitting down and wanting to listen to this thing, I do enjoy the length that it carries with it. But reflecting on it, I'm like, oh man, that was like 2 hours of my life.
It's fun. Okay, so I want to jump in here and it's funny that you say that, because to me, this is one of the most captivating album experiences I can possibly have. This thing has me in its hold for every single second of its runtime. Like, this album doesn't lose me one time. If I could not put this thing on in the background and do something else, I would just start listening to Be Kind and forget about what I was doing. Because, and the thing is, and I think this reveals itself with further listening, and I'm not saying you didn't hear it. I'm not trying to say that. It's just the fact that you didn't bring it up so early reminds me of how long it took me to really see this element of the album, because my initial listens of this were like, wow, this is weird, and this is repetitive, and I like this groove, and this is spacey and cool. But as I listened to it more and more, and I heard those climaxes, and I realized that this album has the exact same kind of tension and release that even a pop listener wants to get out of a pop song, in a completely different way, of course. But the same idea there that you create repetition and familiarity so that you can subvert it with in the case of a pop song, it's a chorus, and that's your release point. In the case of this album creates familiarity by hammering into a groove for an extended period of time, but building up to a certain point where it can explode into an incredible finale. And that's kind of the thing, is like, that's why this album doesn't lose me, because it holds me tight, and I'm waiting, and I'm like, not only are the grooves themselves incredible, and the way that they build incredible, and all of the sounds and the production incredible, because it's all incredible, but I'm waiting for that moment where this band just blows my mind, and they do it track after track. The only one that doesn't do something like that is Some Things We Do, but I hope you would agree and understand the placement of that song as like a lull after Bring the Sun, right? And even that song captivates me too, with its incredible weepy strings and the dissonant and eerie sound of the whole thing. That it has its own build, it just never climaxes in the same way the other songs do. But and that's kind of my point of contention with you here. And I understand completely where you're coming from because, to be totally clear, I enjoyed this album from my first few listens of it way back like 4 years ago, probably more than that now. But it was like there was always like, man, that was so long, and these songs are so long. And Bring the Sun, I was just like half falling asleep by the end. But something about it just kept drawing me back. And when I realized what this band was doing and what they were striving for with these climaxes, it really not only changed my perception of this album, but it allowed me to love it that much more than I already did.
Okay, so I think with that, Lewis, obviously, if people want to hear your thoughts on this, I know you have a whole another show completely dedicated to it. So
and
I think
a retrospective.
So I think I'm ready to move on to let's end this showdown. Put down the final scores.
Okay, so I'll put up the Thank You Next card again. Let's give our final thoughts. So I will begin because I was recommended this. Thank You Next to me is better than My Everything because I thought My Everything was bad. And that's the difference between that and this. I didn't like this album, but I also didn't dislike it, which lands Ariana Grande's Thank You Next at a 5 out of 10 for me. Flatline, dead in the middle, 5 out of 10. And I want to say as my final thought that I really do think Ariana Grande, and I actually have genuine hope for a direction she could take, because when I heard Ghostin', I thought, what if Ariana Grande made an art pop album? And I was like, man, I would be so down for that, because that song alone showed, man, she could really make a masterpiece. I could honestly see it happening, but I just don't think this is it. It's sleepy, vibey music, and if anybody really knows my music taste, I've never really been into that stuff anyway. But even then, I don't think there's anything special about her work, sorry, not her work, about her take on that sort of sound. So would I recommend this? I wouldn't know.
Well, I think that this is definitely her best album. I mentioned it before. I think I give this probably a 9 out of 10. I really enjoy this album. Every listen to this album, I've found new things. I think that it's pretty complex. I think it's very personal and very introspective. I'm also still surprised that it was only produced in like 6 months, essentially. I do think there's 1 or 2 tracks on here that I'm not the biggest fan of, but for the most part, I think that it all flows and it's all telling a very interesting story. It's very sonically consistent, and I think that for the most part, everything on here is just incredible. And I would definitely recommend this.
I just want to respond to a question. Do I like her? I don't know her. So... do I like her? I like I said,
don't know.
I think she came through as a personality a lot more in this album than the other one. And I got a lot more of who Ariana is on this record. And that was cool to hear. But yeah, I don't know her. So,
Lewis, her brother was on Big Brother. So.
Oh, I like her. Yeah, I like her now. We're best friends. All right. Okay. And Steven, you should go first to be kind. I know you just went, but I recommended this to you.
So this is the big one, everyone. Now the question is, if I put this at a higher score than Ariana Grande, what will that mean for the balance of the universe?
I don't know.
Well, I'm going to give this a fat 2 out of 10.
Nice, sick.
Oh, take that. No, actually, I'm giving this also a 9 out of 10. So I guess in the end, they threw some punches back and forth, but ultimately they're both knocked out on the ground. Nice. All the fans are like, do we go home or what do we do now? So I give it a 9 out of 10. As I mentioned, I think that its length really wears me down. Although, Lewis, I definitely agree with kind of your closing statement in that even still, every time I'm kind of drawn back in. So I think that if I continue to look at this, I will probably even listen to this more, honestly. And I can't say that for a lot of the things that we look at here, because I'm curious and I'm interested to see how my own take of this will expand and complexify as I continue to listen to it. I would definitely recommend this.
Yeah, and I can assure you that there's more to get out of this album than what you have. And again, it's not just because of what you said, or it's because like, oh, well, you don't like it as much as me, so clearly you just don't get it. But it's super fucking long, right? And you were saying like, I get wore me down. Like, yeah, so there's a lot, and like I said, the intricacies of this thing, of which there's so many, like, are the kind of things you only grasp if you pay attention to this throughout its entire runtime, which I can't expect most people to do. But yes. Look, third favorite album of all time. So obviously this is a 5 out of 10 for me. You know, it's just kind of average. I'm just not really. I mean, you know, yeah. It's good, but like, is it my everything? I mean, I can't.
See, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's like
I can't go that far. I can't go that far. You know,
when we've all listened to God in our ears,
yeah.
whispering sweet lullabies. Like, where can we really stack anything up?
Yeah. So anyway. Yeah, it's a 10 out of 10. I mean, everybody knows I gave it that score because I already gave it that score in the retrospective. But yeah. So, I mean, look, third favorite album of all time here. This thing continues to impress me on every listen. I cannot find musical climaxes they'll be delivered with this level of consistency on any other album. And frankly, there's nothing else that I've heard that is quite like this. I've heard things that are like it, but nothing that like really hits this mark in the same way that this album does. And I think that what the band was going for here is not only a great idea, but it's a great idea that they executed better than I could imagine any band ever executing. It really astonishes me how amazing that this is. And to this, and yeah, I'm not going to stop listening to it anytime soon. And it's one of, well, maybe I shouldn't say that because I could save it for another rec. So anyway, all I got to say is, you know, yeah, 10 out of 10. Of course I recommend this. And I think that does, so to summarize, in my view, To Be Kind is a better album, or it's a better album than Ariana Grande's Thank You Next. Now, I understand that's a really hot take. I understand you guys are going to be really mad about that. And I'm really sorry for my hot take, okay?
So, Swans wobbles back up onto its feet, puts its fist down.
Damn.
Its sideline, they open the cut, they put the compress on, and Swans is back in it.
Exactly. And Swans raises the boxing glove, because it's boxing now, I guess.
Yep.
And succeeds.
And then they climb the ladder and get the money out of the thing. Isn't that something that happens in wrestling?
Probably. And I think that'll pretty much do it. So do we want to move on?
The octagon explodes and everyone is ready. I don't know how any of these things work.
It's wrestling. Something happens. There you go. Woo. Okay. Yeah, so I think we should move on to the recommendations section, and I will be specific. This was episode 1 of a trilogy of RE-RECC, which means that we are going to be recommending, we're going to be giving each other RE-RECCs yet again for next episode, and you can expect the same thing in that episode. That'll be RE-RECC 2. So, pretty cool, which means, Steven, I will... Oh, wait, shit, actually, you should be going first. I'm dumb. There you go, Steven. What do you RE-RECC to me?
So next week is our second part of our third part series of the RE-RECCs. So Lewis, now you can edit the other part out.
Okay, got it.
Okay, cool. Lewis, I'm going to recommend to you Vampire Weekend's first album titled Vampire Weekend. Vampire Weekend came out in 2008. I think that's all I want to say about it. Oh, and just I guess we could add too, Lewis, before I had recommended to you Vampire Weekend's third album, now out of 4 because they just released a new album. But before I had recommended to you their third album, Modern Vampires of the City.
That is correct, and with that, I will be giving my RE-RECC to Steven. So, Steven, I'm going to be recommending to you the album Animals by Pink Floyd. Previously, I recommended Steven the album A Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd. And so basically, I'm just trying to show, what was Pink Floyd's best album. And this is like a what happened. How did Pink Floyd go from the masterpiece Momentary Lapse of Reason to the insane, just dog shit Animals? And with that, I think that pretty much concludes our RE-RECC for today. If that's correct. I hope you all enjoyed the showdown.
Lewis, I was hoping... Oh, never mind, actually. You know what? I'll save it.
Okay, cool.
We still have one more of these in our 3-parter.
We do have one more of these, and yes, that is accurate. And now, yeah, so keep that in mind, guys. This was RE-RECC episode 1. There will be a RE-RECC 2, and there will be a RE-RECC 3. Yeah, so cool. Do you have anything else to add before we go, or do you want to send us out here?
No, I'll just go ahead and send us out. So with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.